In a word, it's chaos.
You'll have to see it to believe it. Whoever said that must have been talking about Talladega. It's a place where chaos mixes with speed. Where a town turns into a city. And a playoffs weekend becomes a lifetime of memories. It's a tradition like no other. At a track like no other. And after it's all over, you still won't believe it ever happened. Get your tickets now at TalladegaSuperspeedway.com.
Roll Tide and welcome to this edition of Crimson Drive, driven by NASCAR. This is Roger Hoover. Great to be with you in our Tuscaloosa studios as we're nearing the end of July. That means we're nearing the end of the offseason for Alabama athletics. So we'll start to turn the calendar next week to August, and that means that soccer, volleyball, and football are just around the corner. But we're glad you're with us for this edition again of Crimson Drive, driven by NASCAR. We'll start going through everything coming up on the show today. Thanks to our friends at RJ Young. RJ Young is the official technology solutions provider of Crimson Drive. They've given us a smart board to go through everything coming up on the show, plus all of our headlines for today. We're going to be talking a lot of football, of course, as we preview the season. No one better to talk to than Phil Steele, who's been previewing college football since the 90s with his magazine, Phil Steele's College Football Preview. So we'll get his thoughts on the Alabama Crimson Tide, plus the rest of the SEC coming up. And then we'll chat more football with Austin Hannon from Bama Central. He covered Alabama's day at Media Days last week. As a matter of fact, covered all of Media Days. So really good insights from Austin on Alabama football and some baseball talk near the end of the conversation as well. Then we'll take a look back to some courtside cam highlights, which we haven't had on the show since March, since the basketball season came to an end. But we had a really good announcement earlier in the week that the Liberty Flames will be coming to Birmingham to take on the Crimson Tide in the C.M. Newton Classic. These teams met last year in Tuscaloosa back in November, so we wanted to take a look back at that ball game. Now going through the headlines, first for the Crimson Tide football team. Last week, of course, a great experience at SEC Media Days in Nashville as we had one-on-one interviews with J.C. Latham along with Kool-Aid McKinstry and Dallas Turner, as well as thoughts from Coach Saban on last week's edition of Crimson Drive. Certainly invite all of you to check out those interviews. On Friday, we learned that Alabama had 16 spots on all SEC preseason teams and some notable players on the first team, J.C. Latham, Dallas Turner, Kool-Aid McKinstry. All those guys were in Nashville. But how about the specialist, Will Reichard, and then probably the funniest man on the team, Neelan Hibbett, the long snapper. If you follow him on social media, you know what I'm talking about. He was also recognized as a preseason All-SEC first-team long snapper for the Crimson Tide. Along with those spots on the All-SEC preseason teams, Alabama was selected to win the SEC West. Georgia was picked to win the SEC East, and Georgia got more votes than Alabama for determining an SEC champion, but Alabama right behind Georgia in that voting as well. So again, the Crimson Tide picked to win the SEC West once again. Other headlines going to basketball. As we mentioned, the C.M. Newton Classic was announced earlier this week, and we know the matchup. It will be the Alabama Crimson Tide against the Liberty Flames. The game will be held a little later than normal. Usually it's in mid-December or early December, but this year the game will be played right before the start of conference play, December 30th, 2023, at Birmingham's Legacy Arena, a place where the Crimson Tide, of course, played well last year in the first and second rounds of the NCAA tournament, but really trying to get a victory back in this event. After last year, Crimson Tide fell to Gonzaga, the year before a loss to Davidson. So hopefully this year, Alabama against Liberty will be a repeat of the game. We'll see some courtside cam highlights of from a little bit later on of the game we saw last year. Tickets for that game will go on sale October 3rd. You want to make sure you get those tickets because, again, they will be going like crazy for Alabama against Liberty. Final notes on Crimson Tide athletics. Baseball team, really good news. Jenny Sanders, one of our favorites, director of operations. She kept Chris Stewart and I really well fed all throughout this past baseball season. We thank Jenny for all of her work, already doing a lot in operations. Now she is the director of operations for Rob Vaughn's baseball program. Ryan White is competing this weekend at the World Aquatics Championships in Japan, representing Team USA. And again, her first event is coming up later this evening. Then some really good news from the LPGA Tour. Cheyenne Knight, Alabama alum, won the Dow Great Lakes Bay Invitational along with her teammate, and hopefully next week we'll have a conversation with Cheyenne about her great performance getting to be a part of a winning team at the only team event in the LPGA season, but great work by her. Also one of her former teammates, Emma Talley, doing really well in that event last week as well on the LPGA Tour. But for the rest of the show, for the most part, we're going to be talking some football, and no one, again, better to talk to than Phil Steele. He's been the most accurate predictor of what's going to happen in college football seasons over the last 20-plus years. He likes where this Crimson Tide football team is entering the 2023 season. It is our pleasure to talk football once again with Phil Steele. This time of the year really is Phil Steele's season with his college football preview. That is out, of course, the Crimson Tide on the cover with Kool-Aid McKinstry. And Phil, it's great to talk to you. We love this time of the season. How's everything going for you as we gear up for football?
You know, everything is going great, Roger, and always enjoy our conversations each and every year.
Absolutely. Well, of course, our focus is the Alabama Crimson Tide, and you have Alabama in your predictions and the forecast for the SEC winning the West Division. Just what do you see out of Nick Saban and the Crimson Tide this year?
Well, you know, when you look at Alabama, there are questions. I mean, they come in number 127 on my experience chart, only 5 starters back on offense, 5 on defense. Last year, they had a really bad year, 11-2, finished number 5 in the country. But Nick Saban's still there, and they've got a ton of talent back. And while they don't even know who the quarterback is, is it going to be Tyler Buckner? Will it be Jalen Milroe? Will it be Ty Simpson? I think whoever wins the job will have a fine year, especially with the supporting cast. I like the offensive line. I rate that unit in my top 25. The receiving core, I rate number 7. They're actually improved at the depth at receiver this year. And the running backs, despite losing Gibbs, I have my number 15 set of running backs this year. Defensively, I think they're stronger even than last year. You look at them at the linebacking core, number 16. I rate them the number 4 secondary in the country, led by Kool-Aid McKinstry. Caleb Downs comes in as a true freshman. I'm looking for big things out of him. And the special teams are solid. I rate them number 4. Alabama's struggled on the road the last 2 years. If you look at their how they've played there, they've had some close wins and some losses as well. This year, they get both Texas and LSU at home, where they're unbeatable, and I think they beat both Texas and LSU at home. They do have to play Texas A&M on the road, which is their toughest road game on the year. But overall, I've got Alabama number 4 coming into the season, making the playoff, and it's good for Alabama not to be preseason number 1. I believe there's only been 1 year preseason number 1 where they won the national title. Now they're back in the area where they're not the big favorite to win it all, and that's usually when Nick Saban's the most dangerous. The last time they weren't preseason number 1 was 2020 when they went 13-0 and won the national title.
Did not having an established starter at quarterback made things more difficult for you to forecast where you see the Crimson Tide, or do you feel pretty comfortable with the quarterback options that Alabama has?
Yeah, it did make it a little more difficult, but as mentioned, I think all 3 quarterbacks, whoever wins the job, will have earned it. I mean, it's good competition. They've got 3 really good candidates battling for the job. So I think at the end of the year, you're going to be looking at the Alabama quarterback situation as pretty good.
Well, we certainly like the sound of that. Of course, the Crimson Tide picked to win the West in your preseason forecast in the SEC. What do you see elsewhere in the division? Who could be some of the challengers for the Crimson Tide in the SEC West this year?
Yeah, I think the 2 main challengers to Alabama, number 1, of course, LSU, who won the West last year and won that game in overtime against Bama on the 2-point conversion. Now LSU's got to travel to face Alabama on the road. But this LSU team's actually very experienced. They've got 8 starters back on offense, 7 on defense. Brian Kelly is a second-year head coach, and I talked to probably 123 of the 133 head coaches, and every second-year head coach throughout the years has told me, Roger, that we're in much better shape this year. We know the players know our systems, and that's, I think, the case with LSU. They're a more experienced team. Everybody knows the systems. I think they're a dangerous team. I like the fact Alabama gets them at home. And then a surprise contender, I think, in the West is Texas A&M. When I look at the Aggies, last year, Texas A&M was one of those inexperienced teams. They came in number 124 in my experience chart, and they lost their top wide receiver, Anaya Smith. Week 4, they used 3 different starting quarterbacks due to injuries, and had some injuries on the defensive side of the ball and the offensive line as well. But last year when I was going over the team with Coach Fisher, it seemed like we'd get to the end of a lot of the write-ups, like the offensive line. I'd ask him for his recap, and he'd say, Phil, we're going to have one of the best offensive lines in college football next year. And it's because they were so inexperienced. This year, they're number 14 on my experience chart. And remember last year, A&M beat LSU, won that game 38-23 at home, and was at the Alabama 2-yard line at the end of the game with the chance to win that one. So I think A&M's going to be a surprise team this year.
Certainly will be a tough game for the Crimson Tide going to College Station. Then on the other side of the SEC, and this is the final year we will have the SEC East, the SEC West, but no surprise to see Georgia atop the SEC East. What do you think the Bulldogs have in store for this year?
Well, last year they lost 9 draft picks, and this year they only lost 5. Last year they lost 3 first-round draft picks off the D-line. This year they lose 1 first-round draft pick. So they're actually more experienced defensively. I think they will have one of the best defenses in the country, if not the best. Offensively, they have my number 1 rated offensive line led by Cedric Van Pran. They've got my number 4 set of receivers led by tight end Brock Bowers. And they also added Ra Thomas, who was the leading receiver from Mississippi State. They added Dominic Lovett, who was the leading receiver from Missouri. So that's an improved receiving core. The running backs are solid. Now, they have a first-year starting quarterback, but Carson Beck is the starter, unlike Alabama, which has a question mark, and he's been in the system for 4 years. He's a guy that's 6'4", 215 pounds. He was my number 6 rated quarterback out of high school, and I think he's got a great supporting cast. And unlike Bama, which has some pretty tough games, Georgia's going to be a double-digit favorite in their first 10 games this year. In fact, the only game they won't be a double-digit favorite is a road trip to Tennessee, Week 11. By that time, Carson Beck will have 10 starts under his belt. So I think when you look at the talent and the schedule, Georgia's clearly a threat to go unbeaten this year and maybe get that first three-peat since the 1930s when the Minnesota Golden Gophers did it.
Well, last year, one of the big surprise teams in college football was in the SEC East. The Tennessee Volunteers obviously beat Alabama and finished with a 10-2 record before going on to beat Clemson in the Orange Bowl. What do you see from the Vols this year? Any other surprise teams we need to keep an eye out for in the SEC East?
Yeah, I think the main challenger to Georgia in the East is going to be Tennessee this year, and the key is going to be Joe Milton at quarterback. Now, Joe Milton is one of those guys that NFL scouts are drooling over. He's got the size, the arm strength. He's now in his 3rd year in the system, did well when called upon late, led the nice win in the bowl game over Clemson. The key is going to be interceptions. Last year, Hendon Hooker threw 2 interceptions all year. Can Joe Milton keep it at that type of level? Because if he does, I like the running back core. The receivers are dangerous. Dante Thornton, I think, is going to be the perhaps the SEC newcomer of the year, coming over from Oregon, playing in that pass offense. They've got a veteran offensive line. The defense is stronger. And the key is really going to be Joe Milton as to whether or not they can actually get to Georgia. Now, keep in mind, last year they were number 1 in the playoff committee, and Georgia was number 2, and Georgia handled them pretty handily, 27-13. Now they get them at home, so I think that's really going to be the game that decides the East, but I went with Georgia to win that one, but I think Tennessee is the main challenger. South Carolina I've got coming in 3rd. They get Florida at home. They get Kentucky at home, and I think that's going to be huge for them, having those 2 teams at home.
Nearly every team we've talked about so far, Phil, we've mentioned some transfers and some impact transfers. Obviously, teams lose some players as well going to other schools. Just for you, as you start to forecast what the college football season is going to look like, how much has the transfer portal changed how you're able to go about your business and trying to determine these rosters and figure out who can be the best teams?
Yeah, drastically, Roger. And, you look at, maybe 10 years ago, I was able to go to the press sometime in May because you knew the rosters. And now here, the portal closed May 15th. And it's not like I could go to the press May 15th because the players were just entering the portal. We didn't know where they were going to land. So I had to give it 3 weeks to find out where the majority of the players landed. And I think we've captured about 96, 97% of the players out of the portal by going to the press on June 7th. But made it a lot more hectic those final 3 weeks. I was getting texts from coaches on June 6th saying, hey, we just signed this guy. And all of a sudden we had to update the team page and frantically go through and get everything so we could get every page of the press on June 7th. It's made it a lot more difficult, this portal.
I definitely understand that. Well, taking a look nationally, obviously, we've talked about Georgia in the East, Alabama in the West, and hopefully that will be the matchup maybe coming up in Atlanta in early December to determine an SEC champion. Could you see two SEC teams getting in the college football playoff field, or nationally, are there going to be a lot of teams that dominate their leagues to get a berth into the college football playoff?
Yeah, and in the magazine, Roger, I did pick both Georgia and Alabama to make the playoff this year, so I'm calling for two from the SEC. I think when you get out to the Pac-12, there's a lot of good teams in the Pac-12, and they all seem to play each other in a 4 or 5 week span. I think the Pac-12 probably beats itself up. When you look at the Big Ten, you've got Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, all rank in the top 5 in my power poll, but Penn State has to play at Ohio State. Ohio State has to play at Michigan. Michigan has to play at Penn State. I could see losses for those guys, although I did pick Michigan to make the playoff this year. And you go to the Big 12. The Big 12 is just a conference that I could pick one of the top 8 teams to win that league and make a good case for them. It's a very deep league. I went with Texas, but they've got some tough games, including Bama on the road. So I'm not sure if the Big 12 champ makes the playoff. And then out of the ACC, I did pick Clemson to make the playoff. I think Florida may be the preseason favorite to win the ACC, but I really like Clemson. In fact, when I was talking to Coach Sweeney going over the team with him, he told me that while this defensive line doesn't have the star power of that outstanding 2018 defensive line, that they're actually deeper in talent and experience. They've got Kate Klubnik at QB, who I think will have a good year with Garrett Riley coming in from TCU as the offensive coordinator. And so with the best defensive line in the country, an improved offensive line, improved receiving core, I've got Clemson actually running the table, as their 2 toughest games are Florida State and Notre Dame at home. So my playoff 4 are Clemson, Michigan, Alabama, and Georgia.
Well, we always love talking about the college football playoff. Just before that, of course, we always have the Heisman Trophy presentation in New York. Who are some contenders to head to the Big Apple this season and maybe in Heisman contention?
Well, Caleb Williams is the front runner because he's the returnee. And if you're going to say Caleb Williams or the field, I'm going to take the field, Roger, because only one Heisman winner has ever repeated. And when you look at Caleb Williams, he's not only competing against every other player in the country, but he's competing against himself last year. And last year he threw for 4,500 yards, hit 67% of his passes, had a 42-5 ratio. If he has anything less than that, people are going to say he had an off year. So that's the problem with teams or players not being able to repeat as the Heisman. But other players to look at, Drake May in North Carolina, Jordan Travis of Florida State, Michael Penix in Washington, Bo Nix of Oregon. You've got Braylon Allen in Wisconsin, Marvin Harrison of Ohio State, Joe Milton, Tennessee, J.J. McCarthy, Michigan. I even like Sam Hartman of Notre Dame coming in, and Carson Beck of Georgia. A couple of guys that are like 18-1 to win the Heisman. I think both quarterbacks will be playing on successful teams and maybe in New York for the Heisman ceremony.
Of course, in my job, I'm able to go to every Alabama football game, and that's basically the only game I see all day. Maybe I'll catch a glimpse of a late game or an early game, depending on the schedule for the Tide. But you, of course, watch nearly every game. You have a great picture in your guide about how many games you're able to watch and the setup you have. But can you tell our fans just how many games you're watching on a given day and all the screens you have to watch them on?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Roger. I've got 12 TVs in front of me, so I'm watching 12 games all day long, and I also have the ability on my computer next to me to have another one streaming, so I can actually have 13 games going on at once, and that's about all I can capture at one time. I have a lot of Diet Mountain Dew down during the course of the day, but it's pretty electric, pretty intense the entire day, and it's all the way until that 3 o'clock game and 3 o'clock in the morning Hawaii game ends.
That's certainly a very busy day, but a good day. Well, all of that helps you prepare the magazine. And again, I picked up this edition at the Barnes & Noble near my home in Birmingham. Where else can fans go to not only pick up your guide for, of course, Division I college football and the FBS, but also the FCS preview we understand is out?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Roger. Now, unlike past years where you could drive around and get the magazine pretty much everywhere, Walmart, grocery stores, places like that, this year it is exclusively at Barnes & Noble and Books A Million. So Barnes & Noble and Books A Million are your 2 brick-and-mortar stores where you can get it exclusively, and they've got copies right now. Or you can go online to philsteele.com, and at philsteele.com, if you order the hard copy, we give you the digital magazine for free, and the digital magazine's actually updated all the way through September. As an example, for Northwestern. We've already got the head coach there is David Braun, replacing Pat Fitzgerald. So we updated all the way through September. And as you touched on, brand new this year, 2 full pages on every FCS team. And keep in mind, there are 112 FCS versus FBS games. So if you want to get up to date with any FCS team out there, the FCS magazine is available digital only at philsteele.com.
Well, we look forward to the college football season, Phil. Again, every time we talk to you, usually in late July, we know it's just around the corner. So thank you for giving us that football feeling, and thank you for the great work that you continue to do for the magazine. And we look forward to seeing what happens this year. But thank you again.
Well, sounds great, Roger. And like I said at the beginning, I always enjoy our conversations each and every year, my friend. So thanks for having me on.
Crimson Drive is driven by NASCAR, and don't be the only one to miss out on the NASCAR Cup Series playoffs as they make their return to Alabama on Sunday, October 1st. Witness all-out full-speed racing on the high banks of Talladega and be a part of the electric NASCAR playoffs atmosphere. From the unrivaled camping experience to the cars ripping up laps at nearly 200 miles per hour, Talladega is nothing to mess around with. Lock in your seats for the Yellowwood 500 at TalladegaSuperspeedway.com. Secure your tickets now before it's too late. And we continue on Crimson Drive, driven by NASCAR. Special thanks to Phil Steele for joining us once again, now 4 years in a row here on the Crimson Tide Sports Network to preview the upcoming football season. Of course, all of his work done in the magazine, all the work by our next guest, Austin Hannon, done online for Bama Central. He's a Crimson Tide beat writer, and he was with the Bama Central crew last week in Nashville for SEC Media Days, and we check in with him to talk not just Crimson Tide football, but a little bit of baseball as well. Here's Austin Hannon. Austin, it's good to see you. Saw you last week in Nashville for SEC Media Days. How's everything going as we're almost at the start of football season?
Yeah, things are going great. Summer kind of allows people like me, and I'm assuming you to, get a little bit of break from the daily grind. And obviously with me and Bama Central covering baseball, it kind of goes deep. And in this case, this year goes deep into June. So the sports calendar is kind of a year-round thing. But since then, I've been able to, other than last week in Nashville, get a little time to myself and visit with family and friends and, kind of gear up before this football season gets going here soon.
That's certainly good to hear. Well, it certainly does gear up anytime we're at SEC Media Days, and this year it happened to take place in the Music City. Just from covering Alabama's Day and plus some of your time there as well around the Crimson Tide's media availability, just what were some of your takeaways from what we saw last week?
Yeah, I was there all 4 days. And the feeling around the whole hotel was that Georgia was the new king, right? I think we had heard a lot about that going back to January when they, beat TCU by almost 60 points in the national championship game to win their back-to-back. And Kirby Smart and the Bulldogs came in confident. They kind of talked about how they were, making a quest for that three-peat, which obviously hasn't been done in almost 100 years. We saw Alabama come very close to doing it, maybe a kick six away in 2013 from completing the three-peat. And then Alabama, the next day comes in and they kind of have a different mentality than maybe they did the last year or two. It was more of a, hey, we're not going to come out here and say we're the best team, but we hear what everybody else is saying. We're hearing what people are saying about Georgia, and we're going to focus on ourselves. And we think we have a good team, and we'll see where we're at in December, right? I mean, they're not trying to get it too ahead of anything. There were plenty of questions from, other media members about playing Tennessee and LSU again, and what's it going to be like to play Hugh Freeze at Auburn? And all really they would say was, hey, we're focused on Middle Tennessee State. We're focused on September 2nd in that week 1 game. So, Saban's talked all offseason about how he likes the team he has. They're developing the way he wants them to. Obviously, the quarterbacks is the big thing. But even there, he said he likes what he's seeing from all of them. He just wasn't comfortable to finish baking that cake yet. So I think the team has a lot of confidence, and I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that they're more in the shadows this year than maybe they were last year with Bryce and Will.
Of course, the Crimson Tide are represented by Coach Saban, but as well by players Dallas Turner, Kool-Aid McKinstry, and J.C. Latham. What'd you enjoy about getting to hear from those guys speak for only the most they've ever spoken during their time at Alabama?
Yeah, it's kind of the new wave of the veteran stars for this team. Like I mentioned, they had Bryce and Will last year, and there's been some talk about, hey, maybe that was overshadowing the rest of the guys on the team. And maybe that had something to do with why the team wasn't as good as maybe they were supposed to be. And now you look at this 2023 team and it's, you try to point to, hey, who's like the star guy? Obviously there's a lot of good players on the team, a lot of guys that have been there like Dallas and Kool-Aid, but who is kind of the guy that's going to step up and be the team leader. And it doesn't have to be a guy that's going to win the Heisman Trophy. I think people get that wrong a lot. You can have a team that doesn't maybe have that one guy and still have plenty of success and win a national championship. Maybe this year it's J.C. Latham, maybe it's Dallas Turner, maybe it's Kool-Aid. I think those are probably definitely the three best players on the roster going into the season. And, for good reason, that's why Saban brought them. I think they were a good representation of what this team can be this year. And all three of those guys have a lot of potential to get better and end up, being really high draft picks in April.
And those guys, along with Coach Saban, seems like there's a lot of positive feedback right now on the two new coordinators that are in town. Kevin Steele, the defensive coordinator, and Tommy Rees, the offensive coordinator. What have we learned about those guys so far in Tuscaloosa?
Yeah, Tommy Rees, I think we got to learn a little bit more just because there were a lot of people at media days that knew a lot about him, including Brian Kelly. We heard, the Tuscaloosa News came out with a story saying that Kelly, on the phone told Tommy Rees, I know that was your alma mater. I know that we kind of did that thing together and I got to coach you there, but this Alabama opportunity is not something you want to pass up. And I think you should do it. And he took those wise words from Kelly and decided to join Alabama. And, in spring practice, I believe it was Ja'Cory Brooks that kind of told media members that, hey, maybe Tommy Rees has a little bit more swag to him than Bill O'Brien did. Maybe these younger guys can kind of relate to him a little better. And that's nothing against Bill O'Brien. I mean, obviously he's been an NFL head coach. He's coached Tom Brady to Super Bowls. So it was nothing really against him. I think they were just kind of like, maybe we're relating a little bit better to this guy now. And then of course, Kevin Steele, Nick Saban goes on and on about him all the time about he's a guy that knows the system. He knows the process. He knows this program. He's been there a couple times before already. And maybe that was a good thing. Pete Golding, I think in his own ways is a good defensive coordinator. He's definitely going to bring good things to Ole Miss for a program that's, been needing a defense the last few years with Lane Kiffin. And he'll do his good thing there. He's a Mississippi guy. I think that's a good fit, but maybe it wasn't the right fit at Alabama, and it was time for those two to part ways. And I think this year, there was a lot of talk about, hey, they're going to go get Jeremy Pruitt, and we saw what happened there, and that obviously wasn't possible. And so let's just go get a guy that knows that Nick Saban, knows this Alabama defense, knows what it's like to coach a defense to a successful season in Tuscaloosa, and let's be safe and go get Kevin Steele. I don't think it was a knockout of the park hire, but I think it was one that they were comfortable with. And, kind of getting this defense back on track.
Going back to the offensive side of the ball, we mentioned the quarterback competition that's going on. Coach Saban had the great analogy about a cake baking, got to wait until it's fully ready. But of course, the fans are going to be clamoring for any information to try and figure out which way this competition is going. Is there really anything tangible they can watch throughout fall camp gearing up for week 1 against Middle Tennessee that maybe will kind of show what Alabama could be doing at that position?
Yeah, everybody's got their own opinions on the quarterback thing. And, I've voiced mine. I do think that when we, walk into Bryant-Denny Stadium on September 2nd, the offense takes the field for the first time against Middle Tennessee State, it's going to be Jalen Milroe. I think he will take the first snaps of the game, but I think that they're going to use that game as an opportunity to not, get 3 or maybe 4 guys out there, test them out, see how they do, and not bring in Ty Simpson and Tyler Buckner when the game's already 40-0, but bring them out in meaningful time in the first and second quarter. And kind of rotate drives, see who can handle the system the best, who's, handling a real game. Because, A-Day is A-Day. Those guys weren't all great. Obviously, Buckner wasn't even on the team at that point. And so you didn't really get to see exactly what all these guys were going to look like in a game situation. I do think that Texas game is a really big game on the calendar. I think they might not know the quarterback going into that game, but I think by the end of it, whether or not things go well, don't go well, I think Ty Simpson's your quarterback this year. By the end of that Texas game. And that's no shame to Jalen Milroe. I think they can find ways to get him in the offense this year to make big plays, and we'll see how they do with that. But in terms of fall camp, I don't think you're going to get to hear too much just because they're going to keep it so closed and locked down. And if anybody's going to have an inside source, it's a guy like Roger Hoover that works for CTSN.
Yeah, I'm not going to be breaking any news anytime soon. But regardless of who wins out the quarterback competition or who plays this year, you got to have a good offensive line to protect you. And this week on Bama Central, you broke down Alabama's offensive line. When did you learn about that group?
Yeah, it's a good group. And I think last year's group really, it kind of, teed the fans off because at times it didn't look like they were ready. And those road games against Tennessee and LSU with all the penalties and the holdings and the false starts, and it was a disaster. And at times you'd have to see Bryce Young really have to improvise, and he took some big hits in multiple games last year, and it just wasn't great. And it wasn't what people are used to seeing. When you think back to the old days of DJ Fluker and Barrett Jones and Andre Smith and all these guys that have ended up being NFL players in these last few years, the offensive line hasn't really produced as much talent like that. Obviously, everything starts with J.C. Latham. At this point in the season, this point in July, I'm thinking top 10 NFL pick on him. Tyler Booker right next to him on the line. I think it's a guy that's only a sophomore, but we got to kind of see him grow. And that's hard to say because the guy's huge, but, grow in terms of, fitting into a college scheme. Obviously, anybody that plays at IMG knows, what it's going to be like to go against college talent because they're so loaded at that school. But he kind of got to get a good feeling for playing in the SEC. And I think he's going to be a big guy in the offensive line. Another guy, Seth McLaughlin, I think is going to be a huge veteran on the team this year playing center. He maybe he's not the biggest name and maybe didn't stand out as much, but he's a guy that's going to play center. And he looked really good at center in the back half of last year and kind of anchored that offensive line. And as a senior, I think he can be one of those big leaders that obviously at center, your job is kind of to communicate with the quarterback and whoever that may be for Alabama. It's going to be important just because it is not Bryce Young back there. So they may need a little bit of help.
Austin Hannon covers Alabama football for Bama Central as well as baseball. A lot of great baseball coverage from Austin in his years at the Crimson White, now moving over to Bama Central. And part of that coverage is getting to speak with the new baseball head coach for the Crimson Tide when he was introduced back in June, Rob Vaughn. You had an exclusive sit-down interview. What'd you gain from that conversation and what you've seen from Rob Vaughn since he took the job?
Yeah, really sharp guy. He's done really good things so far already in the program. He came out for his introductory press conference. Everybody kind of thought he killed it. I did too. And it really needed some kind of youthful injection into it, right? This program we've seen over the last, 2 coaches that have been here. Things didn't really go the way that Greg Bird wanted. Obviously the whole thing with Bo Hannon went down in April and, that obviously was devastating for this baseball program. Jason Jackson comes in, brings them to the super regionals. The team kind of explodes onto the scene and it made it, a name for itself in college baseball in this postseason. So that was the first big step. I think the second big step was getting Jason Jackson to stay on staff. I was one of the people that maybe he should have deserved a little bit of a longer look for the head coach job, but I understand now that I'm seeing Rob Vaughn and I'm seeing that Jason Jackson's buying into Rob Vaughn that, hey, maybe this was the right decision by Greg Byrne. And he's obviously had a lot of success in the Big Ten at Maryland. And what does that mean for the SEC? We'll see. I still think this is going to be kind of a rebuilding job for him, even though the team, he didn't like to say that just because the team was so good last year and he felt like there was a lot to build off of, but you're losing a lot, right? I mean, just this offseason, you're losing probably, if not your 2 best players going into next season, and Luke Holman and Colby Shelton. So that's a tough break. That's NIL, that's college sports these days. And, there was opportunities elsewhere for both of those guys. We're still waiting on that Holman decision, but he had to kind of do a little retooling, and he's done that so far this offseason, maybe getting guys that aren't from other SEC schools that you may know, other than TJ McCants, obviously, who won a national championship at Ole Miss, but guys from the Big Ten and that he's seen over the last few years that have had success in that conference. And, they're going to be kind of the ragtag group that gets this rebuild started for him. And, we'll see. I hope the best for the guy because, from what I've seen so far, just a great, young, sharp guy.
Yeah, you had a really good breakdown on your Twitter feed about where basically all the players from last year's team have kind of ended up, whether it's being drafted, being signed. How good was draft season for this last group?
Man, I mean, one of the best they've had in, a long time. It seemed like every round there was 2 or 3 Alabama guys going, and that's great to see, and it's well-deserved. And I think we're still waiting on Jim Jarvis to sign that contract with the Tigers. I told people that I was pretty sure he was going to do it based off what I've been, hearing about him. But what a great draft class. That draft class brought this program back to where, fans have been longing for it to be for a long time, and it was a beautiful thing to really see the Joe and Alabama baseball fans come together for that regional. Even though all those nights were late, it was, people were there, people were cheering, and they won on their home turf and went to the super regionals and obviously went up against, almost an unbeatable force in Wake Forest. But what a year for those guys, great for Andrew Pinckney to go to the 4th round. Grayson Hitt, dealt with that Tommy John, but still going to get his opportunity. So yeah, I couldn't say more about those guys that, committed to this program, stayed in it. And when everything went bad this year, they remained to stay in that and got so much success out of it. Made a great run in Hoover and, of course, won that regional.
Certainly was a special team, and now we're gearing up for a new season of Alabama athletics. So, what can you tell us about the coverage you and your teammates are going to provide at Bama Central?
Everything. We like to kind of boast and brag that we cover more than football and basketball. So when the spring does roll around, we'll obviously have that baseball and softball content that people love. I mean, especially the softball content, it seems like. So it'll be year one without Montana Fouts, right? That's a big thing for Alabama athletics this year. We'll see how they handle that. Obviously, they had their Italy trip, I think this past week with Patrick Murphy. So they had to have some fun, but reality is gonna set in for them once the spring rolls around without their fearless leader. And we already talked a little bit about baseball. And how about the basketball team? Obviously losing Quinterly and losing, 3 guys to the NBA, and just like that, Nate Oates flips it around and turns this might look, like a top 15 team going into the season because of the additions he made. So it should be another great year on Bama Central and with Alabama athletics, and can't wait to get it started here in early September with the football team.
We look forward to your coverage. Austin, Hannon, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
You'll have to see it to believe it. Whoever said that must have been talking about Talladega. It's a place where chaos mixes with speed, and a playoffs weekend becomes a lifetime of memories. Get your tickets now at TalladegaSuperspeedway.com.
All right, now time to shift gears a little bit from all the football and even a little bit at the end with Austin, some baseball conversation, to basketball. It was announced earlier this week that the C.M. Newton Classic is back coming up for this season. Alabama participating once again in the game that'll be played on December 30th at Legacy Arena in Birmingham, and this year's opponent will be the Liberty Flames, one of the top mid-major basketball programs over the last few years. And interestingly enough, last year, early in the season, Liberty came to Tuscaloosa to take on the Alabama Crimson Tide. So with a little bit of basketball, and especially Alabama against Liberty on the brain, here on Crimson Drive, driven by NASCAR, we wanted to look back to our courtside cam highlights from that night. As you know, we have the booth cam going for football season presented by Royal Furniture, and they also sponsored these highlights you're about to see, but also give you a little bit of a glimpse that the booth cam, the courtside cam, will be back coming up for this upcoming season. So we're really fired up about that. And let's take a look back now at Alabama against Liberty from last November. Chris Stewart, Brian Passing, Tom Stipe on the call. Stipe mostly just cheering, but you get the idea. Let's take a look back to last November, Alabama against Liberty.
Finds Burnett, back to Miller, catch and shoot, deep three, bottom. That's a nice start for the Crimson Tide. Right side, Griffin, 3 for the tie, got it to go.
And good to see Rylan Griffin continuing to play well. The freshman off the bench had 14 in his debut.
Left side, Gurley, catch and shoot, 3-ball, bottom. Down low, Porter drives, gives it off to Cleveland. Shot attempt blocked. Bama will work it ahead with numbers. Bradley to the rim, lays it up with the left hand. Rebound grab by Gurley, and Bama now will push it ahead in transition. They'll get it to Miller, top of the arc, steps into a 3, bottom. 4th, bank first 3 of the night for Alabama. They'll work it. Cleveland stripped away by Bama. Great defense by Miller. He starts the 5-on-4. Ahead to Sears. Driving behind the back with a dribble. Gives it off to Miller. Steps into a deep 3. Bottom. No warm-up needed. Miller right on the floor. Hits the bank first 3, and Bama leads by 7 again.
Alabama gets the stop, the deflection, gets out in transition. Liberty not set in their half-court defense, and Bama with an open look.
Sears with it with 15 to shoot. Stopping left wing. 3, hit the iron, deflated, and then fell through the net. Gives it off to Gurley. Fakes a pass back to Jaden. Goes left side, Griffin. Catch and shoot, 3-ball, bottom. Sears with 8 to shoot, gives it to Griffin. Right corner, 3, short. Rebounded, weak side, Bediako. Back out to Sears. Steps into a deep 3, bottom.
Second chance opportunities. The 7-footer, Charles Bediako, with the offensive rebound. A couple of guys spotting up, finds Mark Sears, who knocks down the 3.
Alabama and Bradley into the paint, stopping, spinning, throws up a shot. Oh, and it should have gone, but it didn't. Scrambling, fighting for it. Bediako, tie up, and the arrow is going to favor the Liberty Flames, but I'm telling you, Bradley was an eyelash away from your early clubhouse leader for play of the year. Working his way through traffic. Wisely goes to the right wing. No look pass Griffin for the lay-in and 2.
Talk about the unselfishness, but the ability to drop the dime to a teammate. Rylan Griffin with an easy lay-in from his freshman teammate, Brandon Miller.
Here's Bradley with the basketball, giving it off to Gurley, top of the arc. Now to Miller, deep 3, this side, bottom. 10 3-pointers now for the Tide. Brought to you by Bank First. Driving to the right side, Bradley. No look pass, Bediako, the flush.
Oh, that was pretty. Jaden Bradley getting better and better. He found Charles Bediako. I'm not sure Charles knew he was open until he received the pass, goes up and throws it down.
A heck of an effort from Nate Oates, Alabama Crimson Tide. 95-59, and boy, if you're ever going to play it, now would be one of the times. Heck.
Crimson Drive is driven by NASCAR, and NASCAR is returning to Alabama. Experience unforgettable racing as the NASCAR Cup Series playoffs return to Talladega on October 1st. Secure your tickets today at TalladegaSuperspeedway.com. I know we're all excited for the start of football season, but even watching back those courtside cam highlights gets me ready to be back inside Coleman Coliseum in early November. We've got so much to look forward to as we start to wrap up this edition of Crimson Drive, driven by NASCAR, as we take a look at our Wickles Weekend Update, brought to you by Wickles Pickles. They are wickedly delicious. We have the pickle chips, the relish with us on set. Make sure you check out WicklesPickles.com for the latest from Wickles Pickles. Well, again, we are still a few weeks away from our first athletic events here on campus for the new school year, but we will continue having coverage, and next week we turn the calendar into August, so it's time to start looking not only at Alabama football, but Crimson Tide soccer team will be starting practice soon. We have so much to look forward to. Don't forget Fan Day presented by Yay Alabama will be coming up on August 5th inside Bryant-Denny Stadium. Admission is free to all fans to watch the practice, but to get autographs after the practice is over, you need to be a member of Alabama's NIL entity, Yay Alabama. More information available on the Yay Alabama website. But again, that's coming just a week away. So as we get closer to the football season, we will continue having great coverage for you here on the Crimson Tide Sports Network, specifically with Crimson Drive, driven by NASCAR. Special thanks to all of our guests today, Austin Hannon from Bama Central, as well as college football expert Phil Steele. Thanks as well to Ethan Carabin for putting this show together and even producing those courtside cam highlights way back in November of 2022. But for everybody with the Crimson Tide Sports Network, this is Roger Hoover saying thank you for watching this episode of Crimson Drive, driven by NASCAR. Have a great weekend and roll Tide.